Chapter 8. A Very Loud Voice. Once they had left the wise man, Sarah and Hoggle found that by walking forward, they could move ahead. It made a nice change. Not, however, any more than a nice change, because the maze of hedges turned them left and right and back again so often that it was impossible to make any progress toward the castle. Frequently, it could be seen, its spires and turrets looming in the distance above the hedges, but no matter how far and fast they walked, it remained in the distance. Sarah was still thinking about the wise man. "Hoggle," she asked, "how do you tell when someone's talking sense and when he's talking rubbish?" Hoggle shrugged impatiently.
"How should I know? All I knows is we're going to get ourselves well and truly lost in this place. Let me go back."
"Not on your life. You're sticking with me now until we get there," Sarah said, wondering how much time she had left. Hoggle said, rather non-committally, she thought. Well, she still had his precious string of baubles. He wouldn't get that back until she found Toby, and she judged that nothing would induce him to abandon her while she still had his treasure. Alley, turning, alley, dead end, stone pillar, alley, ornamental shrub, turning, on it went, leading nowhere. Sarah wondered whether it wasn't a closed system, no exit but its entrance, that urn. It was just the kind of puzzle that Jareth would set, to waste what time she had left. But if that were so, she shuddered. Would she have the courage to start over, to go back into the urn, down that ladder, into that awful subterranean passageway? Down, 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 down. She remembered the hands and the oubliette, and that terrifying slashing machine, and Jareth in the beggar costume. She recalled a sentence that her mother had once read aloud to her from a book, as she liked to do when something caught her fancy. "Mind what you say to a beggar, it might be God in disguise." When she saw her mother again, she would tell her, or it might just be the king of the goblins. She shrugged. How could she be expected to have any respect for Jareth? He was dangerous and powerful, obviously, but he was too aware of it, a show-off, really, and mean, a cheat. He had a certain style to him, she could concede that much. He was not unattractive. But how could you respect, still less admire, someone like him? The best word she could think of to describe him was cad. Alley, turning, alley. On they trudged. Hedged in as they were, they couldn't see that they were not completely alone in the maze. The head and coils of a sea serpent rode along above the hedge quite close to them, though had they actually encountered the beast, they might have spotted 3 little pairs of goblin feet running along beneath it, and heard the grunts of goblins supporting the parts of the serpent. Several times they narrowly missed meeting a mounted goblin, with lance and flag, who had been sent out by Jareth to look for them and spent an hour galloping at random. Hoggle was quiet for some time, then he asked,
"Why did you say that about me being your friend?"
"Because you are," she told him candidly. "You may not be much of a friend, but you're the only one I've got in this place." Hoggle thought about it for a while, then he said,
"I ain't never been no one's friend before."
An enormous, blood-curdling roar from somewhere nearby froze the two of them in their tracks. Hoggle spun around, pausing only to say,
"Keep the stuff."
He started to run back, away from the roar. Sarah ran after him and seized hold of his sleeve. "Wait a minute," she said angrily. "Are you my friend or not?" While Hoggle hesitated, another air-trembling roar made up his mind for him.
No, I'm not. Hoggle ain't no one's friend. He looks after himself, like everyone does."
He wriggled his sleeve free.
"Hoggle is Hoggle's friend,"
she heard him yell as he dashed in the opposite direction from the roaring and vanished into the maze. "Hoggle," Sarah called. "You coward!" She heard another frightful roar, but stayed where she was. The monster, whatever it was, did not seem to be getting any closer to her. "Well," she said, speaking aloud to reassure herself, "I'm not going to be afraid. Things are not always what they seem in this place. That's what the wise man said." The sound came again, like a pride of starving lions roaring in unison. "It could be some tiny creature, Sarah told herself, perfectly harmless, just that it happens to have a very loud voice. After all, by far the loudest person at home was Toby, and he couldn't do you any harm. Was there some law that she had never grasped, something to do with the smallest creatures making the loudest noise? Did dinosaurs roar? She decided not. They would probably have made a low growling noise. But what about ants, then? Probably they made a terrible noise somewhere beyond the range of human hearing. As she was not going to run away, the only alternative was to proceed in the direction they had been going, with some shred of faith that forward meant onward. And so, crossing her fingers for luck, she moved tentatively along the hedge alley. When she reached a gap in the hedge and peered cautiously through it, she saw that things were, indeed, not always what they seemed. The roar was coming from a terrifyingly huge beast, but the animal was upside down, suspended by one leg lashed to a tree. It was roaring with pain because 4 goblins were tormenting it with nipper sticks, long poles with small, fierce creatures on the end of them that bit like piranhas whenever they were given the chance. The great beast, who was covered in shaggy ginger hair, flailed out haplessly at the goblins, but the only result was that its body swung to and fro. That improved the game for the goblins, giving each of them the opportunity to dart in ahead of the others and get in a cruel thrust with the nipper stick before the bellowing, swatting beast could complete its swing back. They were clearly having the time of their lives. They vied with each other in how soft a part of the beast's body they could reach, and how long they could hold the nipping teeth in there before they had to jump out of the way of its desperate arms. So absorbed were they that Sarah was able to leave the hedge and come closer without any risk of their noticing her. She was appalled by the scene. "The little beasts," she muttered to herself. She looked around for a weapon and found some small rocks. She picked one up, took careful aim, and threw it at the nearest goblin. It hit him on the head, knocking the visor of his helmet down over his eyes.
"Hey,"
the goblin exclaimed.
"who turned out the lights?"
He lurched around sightlessly, still swinging and thrusting out his nipper stick. The vicious creature on the end of the stick was glad to bite anything within its reach. When it made contact with another goblin, its teeth sank in.
"Ouch, ouch,"
the bitten goblin shrieked.
"Hey, stop that, you." "Stop what?"
asked the first goblin, still prodding out unseeingly. The second goblin was now under furious assault.
"Ah, dogweed, rat's meal."
Spitefully, he retaliated by deliberately using his nipper stick. It was the blinded goblin's turn to wail.
"Help! Who's attacking me? Where are the lights?"
The other 2 goblins had paused in their tormenting of the beast. This was even better fun. They nudged each other and snickered as they watched the fight.
"Go to it,"
one of them shouted.
"Get him,"
yelled the other, hopping up and down in his excitement. Sarah had armed herself with another little rock, and now she threw it. She was astonished at how accurate her aim was today. The rock hit one of the other goblins on the helmet, knocking down his visor. He staggered into his companion, and that one's visor slammed down too with the impact.
"Help!"
cried one.
"It's gone dark."
Squealed the other.
"What's happened? Lights! Where are the lights?"
Meanwhile, the first goblin, still visored and unable to see who was nipping him, decided that his only recourse was to take to his heels. Running blind, he crunched straight into the other 2, who were both staggering now. His nipper stick seized its opportunity. Sarah watched with tears of laughter in her eyes as 3 goblins dueled with each other, helmets over their faces, while the 4th went on cursing his wounds.
"Ouch, I'm being nipped. Lights, help. Ow, stop it. Worm rot, teasel rash."
The uproar faded as the pack of them pursued each other, yelling and yelping, crashing into hedges, falling over roots. Sarah wiped her eyes, and her face became serious as she gazed at the great dangling beast. Having delivered it from its tormentors, she had half a mind to leave well enough alone and steal away. But the pity she felt for the monster was still working in her. She approached it cautiously. What the shaggy brute saw was another tormentor coming. It let out a terrible roar and aimed a great blow at her. She was careful to remain just out of reach. All the time, even to stand there and face the gigantic inverted creature, took more courage than she thought she had. She remembered having read somewhere that you have to speak firmly and with confidence to wild animals. So in her most perfect schoolteacher voice, she told it, "Now stop that!" Another great roar was on its way from the depths of the monster's body, but the beast stopped in mid-roar when it heard itself thus addressed. "Ma?" it said. Sarah clicked her tongue. "Is that any way to treat someone who's trying to help you?" The monster still had its doubts. It tried delivering another bellow and aimed a swipe, but there was not much conviction in it. "Stop it, do you hear?" Sarah was beginning to enjoy herself. It was a role she played well, having had plenty of time to study those who played it every day in the classroom. It was one of the parts she had liked to perform for her mother's amusement. The monster answered, "Now, do you or do you not want me to get you down from that tree?" The monster hung in there for a bit, reflecting on what its options were. It craned its neck to look up at its tethered ankle, reflected again, then turned its face to Sarah. "Ludo, down?" it said. Its voice had become almost deferential. Its face was still fearsome, though, ox-like horns on its head, sunken eyes, an enormous jaw with a fang protruding at each end, and a broad, gaping mouth that looked grim. Sarah steeled herself to approach closely. She felt its warm breath on her face as she stood beside the beast and twisted herself down from the waist to get a look at it the right way up. What she saw surprised her. The great mouth that had looked so grim, with its turned-down corners, had actually been, of course, smiling sweetly at her. Gosh, she reflected, it must often be like that for poor Toby when people lean over him from the pillow of his crib. Not only was the monster grinning at her, it now blinked in a goofy sort of way, which could just mean, "I am in a pickle, aren't I? But all the same, how do you do, and thanks for being nice to me." Sarah returned a cautious smile. She was not going to credit this monster with being uniquely in this place what it seemed to be. "Ludo, down," it repeated. "Ludo," Sarah asked. "Is that your name?" "Ludo, friend." I've had people say that to me before, so I'm not taking anything for granted. But, she shook her head and, more to herself than to Ludo, concluded, "Your eyes are just like Merlin's." Feeling safer now, she ruffled Ludo's ginger head between his horns. He smiled and sighed. She straightened up and looked at the knot tethering Ludo's leg to the branch. It was a simple bowline, which she could release with one tug. With her hand raised, she paused, looked down at Ludo. "I do hope you're not going to turn into a raging monster the moment I let you down from here." Ludo's response was another roar that made the rocks tremble. Sarah leaped back. "I knew it! I can't trust anyone in this place." But then she saw that Ludo, far from aiming a blow at her, was using his paws to rub one or two of the most tender places where the goblins had bitten him with their nipper sticks. "Ludo, hurt," he moaned. Sarah looked more closely at him. He was covered with little bleeding wounds under his fur. "Oh," she cried, "you poor thing." Quickly she reached up, tugged at the rope, and released him. He hit the ground with a mighty thump. With deep little groans, he sat himself up and began to rub his wounded head and the sores inflicted upon him. She watched him, even now uncertain whether she should expect him to thank her or eat her. "Goblins mean to Ludo," he grimaced. "Oh, I know that," she nodded, with more assurance than she felt. "They were terribly mean to you," she told Ludo. She moved closer to him and patted his arm. "But it's all right now." He sniffled, still rubbing. Then his face broke into the most endearing, big, dumb smile she had ever seen, bigger and dumber even than any cartoon. "Friend," Ludo declared. "That's right, Ludo. I'm Sarah." "Sarah, friend." "Yes, I am." She couldn't smile big and dumb like that, but she gave him the best she could do. "And," she added, "I want to ask a favor of you, Ludo." "Huh?" "I have to get to the castle at the center of the labyrinth. Do you know the way there?" Ludo shook his great head, still beaming at her. Sarah sighed, and her shoulders sagged. "You don't know the way either?" Again he shook his head with a small frown of apology. "I wonder if anyone knows how to get through the labyrinth." Sarah rested her chin in her hand philosophically. He was a deer monster, and likely to prove much more trustworthy than that runty, cowardly pipsqueak. But she could have done with a guide. Well, If no one was going to help her, she would find out what she could do on her own. She stood up. Ludo stood with her, massively towering over her. He may be no guide, she thought, but it's nice to have him on my side. Chapter 9. Another door opens. Sarah walked past the hanging tree. Ludo, wincing with the soreness of his nipped body, followed. Behind the tree, 2 high doorways had appeared, set into a stone wall that seemed to be part of a rough forest hedge. On each door was an iron knocker. "Well, look at these," she remarked, glad to have a companion again. It was more fun than talking to herself. They approached the doorways and looked more closely at the knockers. Each had the form of a repulsive face with a ring set in it. The knocker to her left had the ring coming out of its ears. The one on the right held the ring in its mouth. She looked from one to the other. Which to choose? She always found choices hard to make. If there were 2 kinds of cake at a birthday party, she would contrive to have a bit of each, at a decent interval, naturally, and hoping that no one noticed. She looked around the glade, trying to see if there was some other way past this wall. There wasn't, so she examined the knockers. "Well, Ludo," she asked, "which one of these 2 ugly characters shall we choose?" "It's very rude to stare," said the first knocker, the one with the ring set in its ears. Sarah jumped, still not accustomed to the habit that normally inarticulate things had, in the labyrinth, of speaking their minds. "I'm sorry," she said, though she felt that she was scarcely to blame for assuming that a door knocker would have no mind to speak, let alone blunt opinions on acceptable social behavior. "I was just wondering which door to choose, that's all." "What?" the first knocker asked. Sarah was about to reply that where she came from, to say what, was thought of as just as rude as staring. But before she could open her mouth, she heard a mumbling noise from behind her. It was the second knocker with the ring in its mouth. It said something like, "Don't talk with your mouth full," the first knocker said primly. Sarah addressed the second knocker. "I don't understand what you're saying." Then she realized what the problem was. "Ah," she said, "wait a moment." "What was that?" the first knocker inquired. Sarah took hold of the ring in the second knocker's mouth and pulled. It came away easily. The face looked tremendously relieved. It exercised the muscles around its jaw and chin with evident pleasure. "It's so good to get that thing out," it sighed. "What were you saying?" Sarah asked. The first knocker behind her said, "Huh?" The second knocker nodded at the first. "I said it's no good talking to him." "Oh dear me, no. He's deaf as a post, that one, I can tell you." The first knocker said, "Mumble, mumble, mumble. That's you. You're such a wonderful conversational companion, I must say." "You should talk," the second knocker yelled back. "All you do is moan." "It's no good," the first knocker said in a matter-of-fact voice. "I can't hear you." Sarah looked at the second knocker. "Where do these doors lead?" she asked it. "What?" asked the first knocker. "Search me," the second one answered. "We're just the knockers." "Oh," Sarah said, reflecting that she ought to have known better than to expect a simple answer. Well, she had to try either one door or the other. She chose the second one. Having engaged in discourse with it, however slightly, she felt it would somehow have been discourteous to turn her back and choose its neighbor. On the other hand, it could be that knockers would prefer their doors not be opened. She couldn't take it for granted that the knockers would like people to make use of them. Every either had its or. If she weighed the implications of every alternative, would she ever get to make a choice at all? When one door opens, so does another one. She had committed herself to the second door by now, with her hands against it, so she went ahead and pushed. It didn't budge. She pushed harder. She leaned her shoulder against the door. It was as solid as the wall it was set in. She thought of asking Ludo to help her. His gigantic bulk would surely open the door. But she wasn't sure it was the right door to choose, and so, instead, she asked another question. "How do we get through?" "Huh?" said the first knocker. The second one, with an arch smile, replied, "Knock, and the door will open." Ah! She looked at the ring she held and went to put it back in the second knocker's mouth. He made a face. I don't want that thing back in my mouth." And he clamped his lips tightly shut and refused to open them even when she put the ring against his mouth. Oh, come on, Sarah said encouragingly. I want to knock. He shook his head stubbornly. Commented the first knocker morosely as usual. Doesn't want that ring back in his mouth. Can't say I blame him. Then, Sarah said, putting down the ring, I'm afraid I'll have to bother you instead. She walked over to the first knocker and took hold of its ring. Ow, 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 the first knocker protested. Sarah took no notice. She knocked twice upon the heavy door. It swung open. Cautiously, she put her head through the doorway to see what was beyond. She heard giggles, sputters of suppressed laughter, honks, and hoots. Instinctively, she started to grin to herself and went further through the doorway. She turned, waiting for Ludo to follow her. He remained in the doorway, shaking his head. Come on, Ludo. He shook his head again. Well, she thought, can't do any harm to see where this might lead. She would come back for Ludo if she spotted the castle. She was in a sunlit forest with clumps and banks of flowers, daisy-decked hillocks, dingles and dells, shady trees all around. The laughter was infectious. Giggling, she looked hard for the creatures who were enjoying all this merriment. All she could see were the forest plants. Who is it? She called out, chuckling. From right behind her came a laughing snort. She spun around and saw a tree's branch moving to cover a hollow in its trunk that just might have been its mouth. It was the tree, she declared. Tree, wasn't it you? That sparked off a tinkle of giggles at her feet. She looked down and saw a cluster of bluebells shivering and shaking together with amusement. Oh, look, she exclaimed, falling to her knees and giggling with them. They were beside themselves with hilarity now. The tree above her could hold it in no longer. It exploded in a bellow of mirth. Sarah threw her head back and joined in. It was the signal for a general outburst. A tree stump nearby was laughing in a deep, cracked voice. Birds on a branch were hopping and cackling. Another tree was rocking. Ferns waved about. Squirrels and mice peeped from their holes with tears in their eyes. Sarah was helpless with laughter. Catching a breath, she panted, What are we laughing at? I don't know, the tree above her roared. The whole forest shook. Even the grass on the ground was trembling. Sarah was feeling faint. She sat down. Oh, please, please, I must stop. She clutched her sides. In response, the laughter around her redoubled. It reached a pitch of hysterical shrillness. I've never laughed so much in my life, Sarah gasped, flat on her back. Birds convulsed with mirth fell out of the trees and hit the ground head first. She saw their eyes were mad, with pinprick pupils. Other creatures came screaming from under the roots of trees, and as they approached her, she managed to sit up, alarmed by their sinister gaping mouths and crazy eyes. Still laughing, she moaned, Oh, please, please, I must stop. She can't stop, the tree howled, and the whole forest screeched in reply. She got to her feet. Her body and mouth were shaking uncontrollably, but her eyes were haggard. Stop, she whispered, stop. She staggered back toward the open doorway and collapsed. Shrieking hysteria applauded that. She raised her head. She could see Ludo just outside the door, and held up her hand for help. He looked very uneasy and wouldn't come inside the door, but he held his arm out toward her and nodded his great head in encouragement. Her eyes fixed on him, she dragged herself across the last few yards until he could bend down, pick her up, take her outside, and shut the door. The laughter stopped dead. The breeze in the leaves of the maze outside was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. It took her some time to recover. Ludo watched over her anxiously. When she stood up, sniffed, and gave him a small smile, he said, Ludo, glad. Sarah glad, she answered, and ruffled his head. There was nothing for it but to try the other door. She walked across to it, picking up the ring. I'm sorry, she said, pushed the ring against the knocker's lip. He pursed his mouth and resisted her. Oh, come on, she said, and tried again. The knocker frowned and squeezed his lips together even more tightly. Then she had an idea. With her finger and her thumb, she squeezed the knocker's nose. He held out for a while, scowling more and more fiercely, but in the end he had to open his mouth for breath. Damn, he gasped. In a flash, she had the ring back in his mouth and knocked on the door. He was protesting. Sorry, Sarah said. I had to do it. That's all right, the first knocker told her. He's used to it. The door swung open to reveal a forbidding forest. On this side of the wall, they were in sunshine, but through the doorway was a dismal and brooding prospect. Ludo was growling and trying to draw back, but Sarah was not going in without him this time. Come on, she said, and braced herself. There's no other way we can go, except back where we came from, and I'm not doing that. She stepped through the doorway and waited for Ludo to join her. He followed her reluctantly. The door swung shut of its own accord. With a resounding thud, the echo lasted a long time. Sarah shivered. The sky was the color of cast iron, and the forest plants looked shriveled, as though the sun had never shone on them since their first day on earth. She felt terribly dispirited after just a minute in this place, and she looked for Ludo to hearten her. His expression was unhappier than her own. "Oh, come on, Ludo," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Fancy a great thing like you being so scared." Ludo shook his head. "Not good." She shrugged with a heavy heart, turned around again, and wondered which way to go. A path ran in front of her into the forest, but how could anyone take it for granted that a path was the way you wanted to go? "I don't know which way the castle is," she said. Again she looked at Ludo, hoping that from his height he would be able to see it, but he had his head sunk resolutely to his chest, and took no notice. She tried standing on tiptoe. That was no good. Nothing was any good. She felt a tear of despair rim her eye and brushed it irritably away. "There's nothing to be scared of," she said, and felt she had to take some initiative, if only to persuade Ludo to buck up. She peered into the branches of a tree. What she did not see behind her was that the earth opened up behind Ludo and swallowed him into a great hole. He had no time to utter more than the first tremor of a roar before the earth closed again above his head. "Maybe I could climb up there," Sarah was saying. "Then I must be able to see the way to the castle." She took hold of the lowest branch and put her weight on it. It snapped off in her hand with a dry crack like china, and before she could register that it was dead, the whole tree collapsed. Lying before her, she saw not a pile of dead wood, but of bones. There was a dry, rustling noise going on all around, and in dismay she saw the whole forest was collapsing like a series of dinosaur skeletons. One bone tree after the other clattered to the ground, each bringing down the next like dominoes until the entire landscape had been reduced to heaps of bones, all jumbled together, and Sarah knew it was all her fault. The destruction of this delicate balance. She had snapped off the branch. It was too much to bear. She burst out weeping and sank to the ground. She couldn't do anything right. It was all hopeless, quite hopeless. She cried and cried with her hands over her face. Eventually she looked to see if Ludo was crying too. "Ludo?" She looked all around her. He wasn't there. Distractedly, she inspected the bones on the ground to see if any of them had ginger fur on them. "Ludo!" She rushed around the spot where the two of them had been, looking in a panic for any sign of him. She saw none. Above, the sky had grown even darker and more miserable. "Ludo!" she screamed, feeling utterly alone in this desolate bonescape. "Where are you? What's going on?" She ran to get away, anywhere. If she stayed there, she would be bones herself. She ran through the heaps of bones and into another part of the forest, also grim. Huge gnarled roots stretched across the path. The trees had trunks like tight fists. Fallen branches and dead leaves covered the earth. Here and there, a brief vista between the trees offered a way on, but along each one that she took, cobwebs clothed her face. From clumps of ferns, clouds of dark moths flitted up at her. "What's going on?" she whimpered as she ran. The forest got darker as she ran deeper into it. She stumbled into a glade above which the trees were so close that she could not see her feet in the darkness. Still she ran, until a terrifying, bright, savage figure leaped out in front of her. "Yeah!" it screeched. "What's going on?" Sarah's mouth and eyes formed circles. She screamed. Chapter 10. No Problem. Hoggle was hoggling around the hedge maze still, minding his own business, and most of all, minding that the girl had gotten his jewels. He tried to please both her and Jareth, and that was what you got for trying to please everyone. No baubles. When Sarah screamed, he heard her. It stopped him in his tracks, which were heading for the start of the labyrinth. He listened, heard a second scream, wrestled with his rudimentary conscience, came to a decision, and began to run in her direction. He knew his way around this place better than the stupid goblins in the castle. "I'm coming, Sarah," he shouted. He galloped around the corner straight into a pair of knees. Jareth was wearing his cloak and looking quite handsomely fiendish. "Well," he said pleasantly, "if it isn't you." "It isn't me," Hoggle told him, trembling. "And where are you going, Hoggle was staring at Jareth's boots. He said in a different tone of voice to hold his audience's attention. Then he spent a little while scratching his backside, suggesting that a person can't be expected to answer a question while he's plagued with an itch. Jareth was content to wait, with a smile on his lips. At last, Hoggle came up with it. "The little missy. She gave me the slip, but I hears her now." Jareth's eyes narrowed. "So I'm just gonna fetch her, and then lead her straight back to the beginning, just like you told me." He wished the king of the goblins would kick him, or pelt him with slugs, or do anything but smile that nerve-wracking, pleasant smile. "I see," Jareth nodded. "I thought for a moment you were running to help her. But no, you wouldn't. Not after my warnings. That would be stupid." "Ha ha," Hoggle agreed with a trembling heart. "Oh, stupid. You bet it would be stupid. Me? Help her after your warning?" Jareth elegantly inclined his head to examine Hoggle's belt. "Oh dear," he said, seeming concerned. "Poor Hoghead." "Hoggle," Hoggle growled. "I just noticed that your lovely jewels are missing." Hoggle looked down at his sadly unadorned belt. "Oh, yes, so they are. My lovely jewels missing. There now. Better find 'em, eh? But first," he promised in a profoundly reliable voice, "I'm off to fetch the little missy back to the beginning of the labyrinth." He thought of trying to wink, but decided not to. "Just like we planned," he said, and started to march obediently away. "Wait," Jareth told him. Hoggle froze. His eyes closed. "I have a better plan, Hoggle. Give her this." With a wave of his left hand, Jareth produced a bubble from the air. In his hand it became a crystal ball. He waited for Hoggle to turn around and tossed it to him. Hoggle caught it. It had become a peach. Hoggle looked at it dumbfounded. What is it?" "A present." Hoggle's eyebrows beetled. It ain't going to harm the little missy, is it?" he asked slowly. "Oh," Jareth placed his hand over his heart. "Now why the concern?" Hoggle pursed his lips. "Just curious." "Give it to her, Hoggle. That's all you have to do, and all you have to know." Hoggle was torn between fearful obedience, which was familiar to him, and affection, to which he could not have put a name. He stood more erect. "I won't do nothing to harm her." He reckoned that such a moment of defiance might have earned him a pint of earwigs down his breeches at least. Instead, Jareth replied with a pleasant smile that by now was like broken glass on Hoggle's nerves. Come, Hogbrain." The Goblin King laughed teasingly. "I'm surprised at you, losing your ugly head over a girl." "I ain't lost my head," Hoggle scowled. "You don't imagine that a young girl could ever like a repulsive little scab like you, do you?" Hoggle was stung. She said we was..." He stopped himself in mid-blurt, but it was too late. Jareth gave him a coy, sideways grin. "What? Bosom companions? Was that it, Piggle? Piggly Wiggly? Friends, are you?" Hoggle, red-faced, was blinking at his boots again. "Don't matter," he muttered. Jareth's voice came back crisply. "You give her that, Hoggle, or I'll have you tipped straight into the bog of eternal stench before you can blink." In miserable obedience, Hoggle nodded. "Yes." He had started to hurry on his way, assuming the interview was over, when he heard Jareth's voice again. He stopped, rigid, not daring to turn around. "I'll tell you what." Jareth had his head back and was looking down his nose at Hoggle. "If she ever kisses you, I'll turn you into a prince." Hoggle knew there was going to be a catch.
You will?
There was a catch. Prince of the land of stench. Jareth thought that was a capital joke. He was still laughing as he disappeared. Hoggle remained standing still, staring at the peach in his hand. His face registered several emotions at once. Amusement was not among them. Elsewhere, the bright, savage figure that had leaped out in front of Sarah was a fiery, and the fireys are wild. Are they ever? They are wild about how wild they are. She screamed a second time and shrank away from the creature, hands folded across herself. It was a bit like a scrawny fox with a long snout that opened very wide and a bushy tail. Its fur was red-pink-purplish. It walked, or rather bounded, on two chicken-like legs. Its staring eyes were blue with red pupils. It had very long fingers which seemed to be perpetually drumming. "What's happening?" it demanded. She shook her head and opened her mouth to frame some sort of answer, but all that came out was a sob. "Now cut that out right now, you hear?" the fiery told her. "Yeah," agreed another one from behind her, making her start around in a fright. "That ain't gonna do no good." "No, sir," hollered a third one, prancing from the trees and leering wildly at her. "No, sir." A fourth one appeared, and a fifth. "Hey," it called to her rousingly. "Come on, now." She looked around at them all in great alarm. "What do you want?" "Wahoo!" one replied, tapping out a fast rhythm with its fingers on a rock. "Hoot!" said another, setting up a cross rhythm. "What, us?" asked a third. Sarah nodded. "Why, we're just having ourselves a good time." "Oh," Sarah said, confused. "I see." They all slapped their sides at her demure reply and laughed maniacally. One let out a whoop and hit his hand on a log. "She sees," it howled. "Yeah, hey. Can't stick around like that," one told her. "No," said another. "You gotta shake it loose a bit." "Yeah, quit crying. Let it all hang out." They leaped around, hooting and clapping. One struck his finger on the ground, and it ignited like a match. He used it to light a bonfire, then blew his finger out nonchalantly. Sarah was still timidly backing away. "Oh yeah, what you need is a little mess around." "Yes, sir." A fiery jumped over a pair of tree stumps and started using them as drums. The rest broke into an up-tempo dance, clicking and drumming their fingers as they circled around her. Sarah watched in astonishment, standing near the bonfire. She couldn't have fled if she wanted to, with them capering all around her, but in any case, she was rooted to the spot by their antics. She was horrified to see one of the fireys pluck out his eyes, shake them like dice, and throw them. "Yeah," the others all cheered, crowding around to look at them. "Snake eyes." Then the owner of the eyes snatched them up, tossing them into the air like peanuts, and caught them in his eye sockets. The rest were hooting and dancing and clapping. As though to outdo the first, another fiery took his head off his shoulders and threw it in the air. It was kicked and headed around like a soccer ball. Another took his leg off, and with a delicate chip shot hit the head back onto its body. They all cackled and slapped their thighs. The drummer went wild. Meanwhile, the rest crowded around Sarah and tried to persuade her to join in the dance. After seeing their wild pastimes, she was shy and nervous of them. But she thought she had their number now, just crazy good-timers out of their skulls, and she was no longer frightened, not even when one tried to lift her head from her shoulders. "Hey," she protested. "Ouch." "It don't come off," the fiery exclaimed. "What?" The rest were astonished, and they all gathered around in the attempt to decapitate her. "Ow," she said more sternly. "Stop it." "You're right. It's fixed on." "Of course it's fixed on," she told them. "Where you going with a head like that, lady?" "Well, oh." The hopelessness of her predicament flooded back, and she started to sob again. She was missing Ludo terribly, and Hoggle too. "Hey, now, what's up, little lady?" Sarah hiccuped. "I'm just trying to get to Jareth's castle at the end of this labyrinth." "Holy moly. You sure you know what you're doing, lady?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "A hot dog? How about that?" The drummer shouted, "She knows what she's doing." He gave her a drum roll on the tree stumps. "Yeah," the others said, grinning and bopping. "But I've only got a few hours left," Sarah told them. She wondered how few. The fireys whistled and grinned at each other. Well, that ain't no problem. She looked up at them through her tears with a glint of hope in her eyes. It isn't? Why, shoot no. We'll take you there. Yeah, another squawked wildly, waving his fingers above his head. How about us coming along a little, hey? The rest cavorted in a frenzy of excitement, hooting and screeching. A castle? Oh, wow. Well, Sarah said doubtfully, it's kind of you, but you think we're too wild? The fiery's head shot up from his shoulders, and he had to grab it with his hands to press it back into place. The drummer did a big roll. Why, shoot, we ain't that wild. Oh, yes we are, called another. Hey! He formed himself into the shape of an ostrich, ran 2 steps, and exploded. As he put his pieces together again, the rest howled and clapped. Cool, man. Now look, little lady, you can't just go walking through this place on your own-some. Sarah sniffed sadly. Well, I did have a friend, just... Hey, fella with clothes on, right? Hoggle? That Hoggle, yeah. Oh, wow, everyone around these parts knows Hoggle. Really? Sarah asked. Sure, Hog and me, we're like that. The fiery crossed his fingers. Oh, well... Before she could say any more, Sarah felt herself being propelled along by the fireys. All she could see ahead of them was a rocky wilderness. Now the castle's just down along this way, one assured her. Are you sure you know how to get to the center of the labyrinth? She asked nervously. She had precious little time to waste, and she thought she would have preferred to be left to find her own way. But there was no escaping the fireys, who had hold of her clothes in their long fingers and were hopping enthusiastically along with her in tow. Do we know how to get to the center of the labyrinth? They all burst out laughing. Their heads flew up into the air, and their arms had to detach themselves to catch the heads. Why, lady, one screeched, we may be wild, but we sure know where we're going. Yeah, the rest concurred. You want to go to the castle? We're taking you to the castle. Ain't we doing just that thing? Yeah, so you come along with us, little lady. You ain't gotta have no problem. Jareth was watching Sarah from the castle. In his crystal, he saw her distraught face looking around for a way to escape. He held Toby up in front of his sister's picture. Look, Sarah, he murmured. Is this what you're trying to find? Toby gaped at Sarah's face in the crystal. He held a hand out to touch it. Jareth chuckled to himself and put his arms around Toby. So much trouble for such a little thing, Jareth said, shaking his head. He looked at Toby's puzzled face. But not for long. Soon she'll forget all about you, my fine fellow. Just as soon as Hoggle gives her my present. She'll forget everything.